Which one? Yeah, that's what he gave us.
Was it on the seats?
No, we passed it her. And I think he
Turn it over. Oh, okay, I have it on one page.
You should have 3 sets of pages. You should have a translation. You should have a set called Christmas for Adults. And you should have a single piece of paper with 2 pages on it as an additional handout. Okay. So we solved the paper flurry here, all right? Okay. Well, it's good to see you again. Good to be back. So to recap from last week, we began by contrasting the 2 different birth stories in the Gospels. There's only 2 Gospels that record the birth of Jesus, Matthew and Luke. And when we look at them separately, they differ. In fact, a great deal. They have very little in common. Their stories are going in different directions. They have different plots. In one Gospel, Luke, the messages from God are given in visions. In Matthew, they're given in dreams. In Matthew, it's Joseph who hears about the birth of Jesus. In Luke, it's Mary. We saw last week that Luke's gospel is suffused with rejoicing. People singing songs, angels rejoicing in the heavens, etc. None of that we're going to see in Matthew. And then the whole point, or the major point driving Luke's presentation, is to force a contrast in people's minds between 2 different sons of God, Caesar Augustus and Jesus, right? And to help us meditate really on the real nature of power and what God's power looks like. Does it look like imperial power incarnated in the emperor and his armies? Or does it look like the power of Jesus, the power of healing, forgiveness, etc.? And that's, I think, a rather profound thing to think about, regardless of one's religious affiliation. Luke is addressing big scale, right? The Roman Empire. With Matthew, we're going to have a much smaller focus, because Matthew's focused on a strictly Jewish issue, right? And Matthew, we can tell from the way he writes his gospel, he assumes his readers are quite familiar with things Jewish, with history, with the Jewish Bible, with customs, etc. So we see, what we're seeing here is the readers of this gospel, what we might call Matthew's community, the people he's writing for, right, are people who identify with Israel, right, who think of themselves as Israelites, and who are, by the time Matthew writes towards the end of the 1st century, finding that relationship between them and other Jews to becoming more and more fraught. We pick up clues from other places too that the situation between Jews who claimed to be following Jesus as Messiah and other Jews who did not accept that claim was becoming less and less friendly. And it has to do with a number of things, but it's a common phenomenon in religions when a small group begins to have a distinctive set of ideas which differ quite strongly in some cases from the rest of the group. And when they insist that we in the small group, we're right, everybody else is wrong, right? And if you want to be a real Christian or a real Muslim or a real Jew, you will agree with us. And much to their shock, people don't get on board, right? They just they aren't persuaded. And so the group becomes more and more tight-knit and more firm in its beliefs, right? And begins to exhibit hostility towards the rest of our believers who aren't believers. It's a very common phenomenon, and this happens in Judaism. It was going all over the place in the 1st century, there was not much consensus then about what it meant to be a real Jew. Maybe today there still isn't. I don't know. Jewish tradition has always been able to host these discussions in ways that other religions, it gets more violent at times, right? So we're seeing here a sectarian part of Judaism in the process of being separated unwillingly, right, from its own tradition. Okay, and if we look at the very end of Matthew's gospel, the last verse begins with Jesus saying, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me." Right? That's Matthew's view, right? That Jesus incarnates God's will, and that Jesus is the chosen one to mediate to the people of Israel the true interpretation of the teachings of Jesus, right, and to enact God's will among his people. And so Matthew's writing to his own people, his own Jewish followers of Jesus, to persuade them to stick with it. And that no matter what those other bad Jews say about us, we are right and they are wrong. Okay. So in chapters 1 and 2, he's setting the scene, primarily by establishing the credentials of Jesus to be the Messiah of Israel. Because calling him Messiah made no sense to anybody. Right? He hadn't done anything the Messiah was supposed to do. He didn't end war, didn't end disease, didn't bring in the perfect world God was supposed to do, didn't restore Israel to its proper place in God's plan as the most important nation on earth. Jesus had died a disgusting and disgraceful death, and the world hadn't changed a bit. So calling him Messiah was nonsense to most people, right? So Matthew very carefully wants to line up a number of claims in the first 2 chapters about Jesus. First of all, that he has Davidic descent. He's a descendant of King David, because the Messiah was widely believed to be one who would continue the victorious reign of King David, right? When everything was right, supposedly. And that he is, well, let's just stick with that for now, right? He's got 2 things he's thinking about. Now, he has a problem right off because there's some weird agreement that Joseph, remembered as the father of Jesus, was not really his father. So how can he be descended from David if Joseph isn't the blood father of Jesus? And that's his first task, is to establish that. And he does so in a very Jewish way by trotting out this improbably lengthy genealogy, tracing Jesus' descent all the way from, is there an extra translation out there? Because I would like to have one. Thank you. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. This is the book of Genesis of Jesus the Anointed. Actually, Matthew uses the word Genesis in Greek right there. So to make us recall the beginning of the Bible, right? And by calling Jesus anointed, that's the translation of the word Messiah. Messiah, Mashiach in Hebrew, is to have oil put on your head in a ritual of commissioning to do God's special will. Right? Jesus, the anointed son of David, son of Abraham. And then we get the genealogy. It goes down all the way to the end. And in verse 17, he sums up the generations from Abraham to David came to 14. Those from David to the Babylonian exile come to 14. And those from the Babylonian exile to the anointed also come to 14. And here's where commentators begin to scratch their heads, because those numbers don't work out. If you count the names, right, in the first batch, there is 13. So from David to Jesus, there are 14 names, but that's because Matthew has skipped 4 generations in the line of David. Now, whether he did that on purpose or by design, we don't know. But if you compare the list with the list in the book of Kings and Chronicles, you'll see that Matthew has omitted 4 generations from that list. So 18 becomes 14. And then the second one, or the final batch, is 12, unless you count Joseph to Jesus as a generation when Jesus wasn't generated by Joseph, so it's hard to know how Matthew understands that. But there must be something about 3 times 14 that's important to Matthew. Probably to show that history is not random, right? That there are these very specific periods in the plan of God for Israel, and that Jesus comes at the end, right, of this list. And we could get into details if you'd like. On my one-page handout, you can see a chart I've made there of how the 2 genealogies differ and how they come together in certain places. And then the very strange differences between Matthew and Luke's in the number of names that they record. So this gives historians headaches, of course. But I think I want us to focus on what Matthew's intent here is, right? And needs to show that Jesus comes in the fullness of time, in a certain kind of historical appropriateness. Okay. And he says quite clearly there in verse 16, Jacob was the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, who was the mother of Jesus. So you see how the biological genealogy breaks right at the key point. Okay. So how is it that Jesus is entitled to Joseph's genealogy? That's the burden of the next episode. All right. And so we get the genesis of Jesus talked about here. Okay. While his mother Mary, verse 18, was betrothed to Joseph, but before she moved in with him, she was found to be pregnant by the Holy Spirit. Whatever that means. That's a long conversation we won't have today, but notice here that this occurs at a crucial point in the marriage process, right? After the betrothal and before the couple lives together. And that's an established custom in the ancient world, right? That marriage takes place in 2 steps. There's a betrothal. It's got nothing to do with the boy and the girl. It's their parents who work this out in a formal binding contract. They are betrothed. After that, they are married. It's not like engagement. It's a very different issue from our culture, which is a voluntary thing between 2 people, right? Betrothal is a contract, a covenant between 2 families. My son will marry your daughter. And after some time in which the man has to show, the young man, that he's able to support the wife and provide a proper home, then they can live together, right? And that completes the marriage. But after the betrothal, they are married. You can't walk away from that. You have to get a divorce, right? It takes a legal undoing of a betrothal to move away from it. And hence, Joseph's problem. Now, during betrothal, it is assumed that the married couple will have sex, if they can, right? They'll be together alone without a chaperone. People assume this would happen. Any children born in that time are perfectly legitimate children. There's nothing wrong with that. But Joseph knows this child is not his. How does he know Mary's pregnant? We don't know. Matthew doesn't tell us. There's no discussion between Mary and Joseph. She's obviously too early on to be showing, because thing is, if Matthew marries her, if Joseph marries her, no one will be the wiser, right? They'll assume that he's the father of the child. But he knows he's not the daddy of this pregnancy. And he is a righteous man, virtuous man. That's a technical term in Judaism, is someone who follows God's commandments, who does God's will, is a righteous man. And Matthew assumes that Joseph knows that if this child was conceived after the betrothal, then this is adultery. If she conceived before the betrothal, he has no legal right to marry her. She belongs to the man who impregnated her. That's the law of Moses. So he has no good choice here, right? Does he know when she conceived? We're not told. But he's caught in this dilemma. Technically, adulteress could be put to death. We don't know that that happened often or at all, but at least that's what it says, right? And so the scene starts with a righteous man having to make a decision. We don't know what Mary's thinking or feeling. This probably very young girl, pregnant, not by her husband, and a man is deciding her fate. You got to imagine that drama going on, right? And all that fear happening. Right? So that's when we have some divine intervention. We need revelation here to clear up how Joseph is to proceed. And the angel tells him to do two things. Don't hesitate to take Mary as your wife, since the Holy Spirit is responsible for her pregnancy. She'll give birth to a son, and you will name him Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins. And then Matthew breaks the story to tell us that this is fulfilling a prophecy from Isaiah. And that's a whole other fraught issue which we can discuss probably at a later time. And then Matthew translates this Hebrew name, Emmanuel, for his Greek audience. The name means God is with us. Okay, so Joseph is told to do two things. Complete the marriage. You and Mary move in together. Right? And when the child's born, you name him. So by doing these two things, he is accepting the pregnancy by letting her live with him. And by publicly naming the child, he is claiming paternity. So even though, it's not a kind of legal adoption as we would think of it as today, but it's a long-established custom in Israel, other cultures, that when the father names a child, it's being welcomed into the family. Right? And since the child is a male and his first son, then Jesus becomes the legal son of David, entitled to his inheritance and his genealogy. So look what Matthew's done. Right? He's made the case that Joseph has given to Jesus, in all the legal way possible, right, his genealogy, so that Jesus really is, legally, if not biologically, a son of David. And he's done so in very few words, in a way that I think leads us to admire this just and compassionate man, who in a time of great quandary trusts what he had a dream about and takes responsibility for a child who is not his own. Now, if you were making the movie out of this, please help us see some scenes where Mary and Joseph talk about this, right? In which all of the real human drama can come out here, right? The fear she has, the quandary he's in, probably between two teenagers, right? Women were married as soon as they were able to have children. So how old is Mary? We don't know. 13, 14, 15? This is a teenager, pregnant, out of wedlock. Right. We don't know how old he is. He's probably old enough to make a living, so he would not be probably just a young boy. Okay. Now, Matthew's not interested in, well, let me just pause for questions at this point before we go on. Let's pass around a microphone here. Is this thing? Well, you figure out if it's on. Okay.
Hello?
Nope, not yet.
Well, it's on, but it's.
There you go.
There it goes, okay.
Time.
So I'm just curious, I know that in later Jewish practice, the difference between betrothal, which does require a divorce, and marriage is precisely sexual relations. That is, a betrothed couple is not permitted to have sexual relations, and I don't know whether in the ancient world that was different, or what.
As best we can tell from the sketchy hints, later in the Mishnah, right? This was a dispute between Judean and Galilean interpreters. And in Galilee they said yes. In Judea they said no. And since it's the other way around, right? Because they're in Judea in Bethlehem. But you're right. We can't be certain about that. We're extrapolating from later evidence about that.
Bill, tradition, at least as I was aware of it, for portrayals in stained glass, which sometimes comes from the Golden Legend, from that level of documentation. Joseph is portrayed as a middle-aged man.
Yeah.
Where from that?
This is a later Christian fix to the story, right? To explain why we have in the Gospels mentions of Jesus' brothers and sisters, right? Since it's believed, not in the Bible, but it came up that Mary never had sex in her whole life, right? That she and Joseph lived a celibate marriage. That's not in the Bible, but that's a later Christian thing, right? And so how is it that they have other children? Well, the story is that Matthew had a previous marriage, and these are his sons from
Joseph.
and earlier Joseph. Sorry, you think I know the difference, right?
I have one thing is that I've been reading some books of the Apocrypha, and one of them is suggesting that maybe Mary had a connection to the house of David, but I don't think they'd really traced through the female line at that time.
Right, and even if she had, right, inheritance would not come to her through, royal blood does not descend through the queen, right? Okay, Matthew is not interested in the birth of Jesus itself. He doesn't even narrate it. It just happens between chapters 1 and chapters 2, right? What he's interested in is the reactions to it. And he's going to hold up in bold contrast the reactions of these mysterious men from the East and the reactions of the Jewish power structure at the time, as represented by this monster king. Okay. So who are these guys coming from the East? It's always been a difficulty figuring out what to call them. Matthew calls them magoi, which is, plural. And it's based upon an older Persian word, actually, margush. And margush comes from the root meaning power. He's a person of power. He has power to do things in ways that other people can't do, by manipulating hidden forces, or by reading signs in the sky, right? So it's an old Persian word which Matthew takes and gives it a Greek form. The word comes into our language through its Latin plural, magi, which we dutifully mispronounce as magi. But we still don't translate that, right? So when you're translating the Bible, what do you call these people? Do you continue the custom of not using an English word, or do you try to figure out who these guys are? And in this translation, we try to do that. And since these men read the signs of the birth in the stars, we decided to call them astrologers. We got our word magic from this. Okay. Are they wise men? Yeah. Are they kings? No. All right, so the three kings is a much later Christian ornamentation of the scene. So they show up, apparently a couple of years later, and you'll notice that they come to Bethlehem, which is where the couple lives. Quite different from Luke's story, right? Where after 40 days, they leave Bethlehem, go back to their hometown in Nazareth. So astrologers from the east, from Persia, show up in Jerusalem. And they check in with the local king, which is customary and polite and also prudent. Right? And they say, well, where do we find this newborn king? We've seen a star, and we've come to pay him homage. Okay, well, the king's worried about this. King Herod, he had murdered at least one of his sons, a number of his wives. He's a real thug. Okay, this is real, a very evil human being. And so he calls together his advisory board, right? Chief priests and local experts, press them on the information. Where is this anointed one supposed to be born? Well, he's saying in Bethlehem. And they quote a prophet there, the prophet Micah. And Matthew reproduces that prophecy almost accurately. Okay. And again, Bethlehem is associated with David. That's David's hometown. Normally, the city of David is the name for Jerusalem, but in this context, right, Bethlehem is his place. So that's where his Messiah descendant should come from. And then you probably know the story. The king wants to send these astrologers on some reconnaissance mission to find out where this boy is so that I can come and pay him homage too. Right. Okay. And this star, which led them to Jerusalem and then stopped giving them instructions where to go, they had to check in with the king, right? Now it leads them to Bethlehem and points to a specific house. How it does that is not explained. This is by their Magoi. They can figure this stuff out. Now, usually, I mean, it's very common around Christmas time to hear on the radio or something, astronomers talking about the time of Jesus, there was this conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn and the moon, and yeah, and this, okay, well, that's not right. That's all, the years are way off. And besides, this thing moves to a village and points to a certain house. Now, you're not going to get that from Jupiter and Saturn and whatever other else is out there, right? So clearly, Matthew's relying upon the ancient belief that stars are messengers from the gods, or gods themselves, right, who communicate to those who are able to read the signs, to crack the code of the stars. So it's fascinating that, both Jews and Jewish followers of Jesus were supposed to be highly allergic to magic, because that's consorting with powers that are on the dark side. Right? But here we have astrologers who are doing the right thing, who are led by God through their magic to recognize the new king, the new Messiah. And the response from the establishment, right, is brutal. And so Matthew's looking forward to the end of his gospel, right, where the power establishment in Jerusalem, right, the Romans and their collaborators in the high echelons of the priesthood and the Jewish aristocracy conspire. This is in Matthew's mind, at least, right, to murder Jesus. And so here we get that mirroring the front. We also have this part of the sectarian hostility and antagonism between the followers of Jesus and mainstream Jews, right, is this claim that you killed the Messiah, right? And you're gonna pay for that. And so we see that same hint, right, of that kind of duality here early in the story. So like I said last week, this is not a story for children. This is really brutal and hideous story. We're also reminded of a much, much earlier story in the Bible, Moses' story, when the king, the Pharaoh, orders that all the baby boys be killed. Right? And through some miracle, one of those boys escapes that sentence of death and then is able to become the leader of the people. So this is a dead ringer connection of Moses and Jesus. It's a comparison Matthew plays all through his gospel. This kind of parallelism between them. So, verse 15 or 13, well, the episode is that the astrologers are warned in a dream, don't tell Herod, he's an evil man, and they keep it all on the quiet and slip away and go home without revealing where Jesus is. Questions at this point? Let's get you a microphone here.
Do you detect?
Yeah, turn it on, please. There it is. There it
Do you
is.
detect in the visit of the wise men a harmonic of the visit of those strangers who appear in Abraham's house before the birth of Isaac, who Abraham is then called on to be solicitous to, and feels better about it because he's kind of validated that quality in his outlook.
Okay, these are always in the eye of the beholder, these parallels, right? These connections. And besides the number 3, I don't see the similarities actually. This before an important birth. This is after a birth.
I'm just asking, I don't know.
Yeah, I would be cautious about that.
You're the professor.
I'd like, yeah. Yeah, not here, but in other places. Yeah, I would urge you not to pursue that with too much vigor because it's probably not going to play out too
It
well.
won't be on the exam, okay.
It won't be on the exam. And it better not show up on your exam. Yes.
I'm interested in the fact. Oh, I'm sorry.
Right. See, we have to do that because on YouTube they can't hear you.
Okay.
Right.
I'm interested in the fact that Joseph keeps receiving these dreams.
Yes.
Does that mark him as a special person that he's able to receive these dreams?
It marks him as a special person that these dreams were sent to him. Now, how he knew to pay attention to them is one of those things that ancient culture just took for granted, right? That we would not today, right? If someone says, an angel told me in a dream to do thus and so, we'd say, let's up your Thorazine a little bit and see what happens. But this is commonly believed that the gods, right, reveal their will in dreams and in visions. And many times in the ancient writings in Greek, you can't tell whether those visions are happening while they're awake or while they're asleep. They're treated exactly the same in many of these stories, right? So it's a very different thought world that this story unfolds in.
Another question about the Magi.
Sure.
And this is just, I happen to have been reading up on this, the Jews in the Sasanian Empire, which is a later period, and the Magi there as Zoroastrian priests. But I'm just wondering, especially since you say that Matthew is addressing his gospel to Jewish followers of Jesus, whether the Magi are some symbol of the fact that Jesus is also supposed to be of importance to other people besides Jews.
I think that's totally right, because again, at the end of the gospel, Jesus sends his followers out to all the nations, right? And already by the end of the first century, it's becoming apparent to many people that the message of Jesus is finding more support among non-Jewish people than among the people of Israel. So this is, I think you're right to point that out, and thanks for doing so, because it's meant to foreshadow, right, the closing down, right, of any kind of friendly coexistence with official Judaism and the opening up to the world of the Gentiles.
Oh, here.
Would, is it also possible that, what was I gonna say? The Jews, even the Jews that followed Jesus, were they also not happy with inclusion of Gentiles who they saw were pagans?
Yeah, this becomes a flashpoint, we know, certainly from the letters of Paul.
Yeah, that's what I'm speaking from.
When you had these mixed communities, right, of people who come from Jewish, or who are Jews, right, and people who are not. And you can make all kinds of compromises, but what do you do when you sit down to eat together? This is where this becomes a real flashpoint, because food laws, right, are really important. And that's when we have these, I mean, Paul's letters address some of those very difficult conflicts within his own congregation. So yes, that's become an uneasy mix. Now, we do know that Jewish followers of Jesus persisted in Galilee, at least, right, for several generations, late into the first century, in villages, right, sort of just living out Judaism, following the holidays, observing Torah, and believing in Jesus. And so that, in certain places, that flourished for a while. But it didn't last for very long. And then you have this when theologians get involved in the early second century, begin to think about this thing in big scale questions, unfortunately, in the movement that is becoming Christianity, there's no Christian religion yet, but they're moving in that direction. It's built upon a great deal of the Jews were wrong, and God got them. In the year 70, right, the Romans came and put an end to their Jewish problem. That was their final solution to it. And it was a catastrophic event on the human scale, a number of thousands of people, probably over 1 million people, butchered by the Romans, as well as a catastrophic collapse of their temple and their whole religious system. So in the wake of that, there's a lot of blaming going on. Yeah. And this whole thing about the Jews killed Jesus, of course, that's historically nonsense, because the Romans crucified not Jews. Romans didn't care what religion you were. If you were a problem for the empire, you were disposed of. Crucify first, ask questions later. That was their policy. Anything else? By the way, there's all kinds of weird and fascinating Christian lore about these 3 guys. Sometimes they're 7, sometimes they're 12. Have these wonderfully exotic Mesopotamian names given to them. Sometimes they're kings. There's no fixed number. Matthew never says how many there are. We get 3 just from the fact that they offered 3 kinds of gifts. But who knows? It could have been a whole entourage. It could have been 2. We just don't know. And again, I want to emphasize something I said last week. This scene in which you have shepherds and magi in the same scene, that's nowhere in the gospel. That's a combination of Matthew's and Luke's details into a composite story, which is how traditions work. I mean, the Christian tradition is very good at mashing up things together into new creations. That's why it's been able to spread so far around the world. It has a genius for this, and many Christians don't like it. But if you look at the way Christianity exists in, say, Mexico and Nigeria and Norway, you're going to get 3 very different religions based upon a common set of symbols, right? But I digress. Okay, so finally then, there is this, what's called the flight into Egypt, which is, hearing that as a child, right, I thought of them getting on an airplane and taking a, I mean, what's a kid going to think, right? The flight to Egypt. All right, but they flee, literally, for their lives, and they find in Egypt a place of safety, right? Just as the sons of Jacob had at the time of the great famine. So Egypt is a very ambiguous place in the Bible, right? At times a great place of great menace and slavery, at times a welcoming to refugees. And again, this gets a fulfillment of prophecy here. I called my son out of Egypt. Now I want to look at that on your handout, on the back of that one-page thing. I just want to look at this one example of the way Matthew manipulates prophecy. This is called Matthew's use of prophecy. Matthew. Yep. Matthew quotes prophecy 5 times in these 2 chapters. So it's clearly his way of establishing his Jewish bona fides, right? I'm not saying this is from the prophets. I mean, there's no better way to win an argument in Judaism than quoting the Bible. With, of course, your own spin on it. So, but that's always presumed. Okay, so he says, when Jesus was taken by Joseph to Egypt, he says, that fulfilled the prophecy. Out of Egypt, I called my son. Okay. Now, when you look that up in its own context, in the prophet Hosea, which I give you here, you see that Matthew has very carefully, surgically removed it from its context. Because in its context, it cannot mean what Matthew wants it to mean. Matthew wants my son to mean Jesus. It cannot possibly mean that in context or in its original context, right? When Israel was a child, I loved him. Out of Egypt, I called my son. The more I called them, the more they went away from me. They kept sacrificing to the Baals and offering incense to idols. So in Hosea, this is a lament. This is God's lamentation, right, over the ungratefulness of his people. He brought them out of Egypt under Moses from that place of slavery, and look how they repaid me. Right? So clearly Egypt here refers to the whole nation of Israel. And by the way, they're coming out, whereas in Matthew's gospel, they're fleeing to Egypt. So it's not even a good fit in the context of Matthew's story. Hosea is talking about a past event, which Matthew then takes to be a prophecy of a future event. So Matthew here is, by any standard, right, making this prophecy mean something it absolutely cannot mean in its original context. And if we look at all the prophecies Matthew quotes, most of them are that way. Now this is considerably interesting and confusing and somewhat disconcerting. I wrote a whole book about it. It's in the library. If you're having insomnia, I guarantee, and it's not habit forming, right? So just that thing will put you out fast. Okay. All right. And what I found out when writing that book, over way too many years than I had planned, was that what Matthew was doing was pretty standard for his day, right? This was a standard way of Jewish dealing with prophecy in ways that we would think of as quite imaginative, but he was playing by the rules everybody else was playing by. If you look at the way prophecy is used, for instance, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? It's shameless in the same way that this is, right? Taken out of context, words given new meanings, 2 prophecies, words from 2 of them put together to make up a third one. This was a common practice, and it was not considered to be cheating. It was the rules of the game, right? And so even though from our standards, right, this is seen as out of context, blah, 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 at the time, this was the way very sophisticated biblical interpreters operated. Again, we have to reflect on the difference that 2,000 years can make, how we understand these things. All right. However, it gets a bit out of hand at the very end of chapter 2. When we have the story of how when it's time to come back after Herod's dead, the angel in a dream warns Jesus, well, don't go back to Bethlehem, go north to Galilee. Go to this little place called Nazareth. Out of the way place, no one's heard of it. Okay. And he says, in order to fulfill the prediction of the prophets that he will be called a Nazarene. That's nowhere in the Jewish scriptures. No place. And you should read the commentators who, are committed to the belief that there's no mistakes in the Bible, trying to explain how this thing works. It's sad. That's a tough job to have, right? Okay. So again, we're puzzled. Did Matthew just make this thing up? If not, where did it come from? This is one of the great mysteries of interpretation of these chapters. All right. Okay, but I want to show that 5 times Matthew uses prophecy to show that what's happening is fulfilling God's plan for Israel, right? He uses it to talk about this very, shall we say, let's just call it an irregular birth. We get the prophecy from Isaiah. Then we have, after that, what's the other thing there? Yeah, we have the prophecy, out of Egypt I've called my son. So that recalls the Exodus, the coming out of Egypt under Moses. Then we have Bethlehem being focused on as the birthplace of Jesus, and we get a reference to King David, right? 3 landmark places in the history of the people. Then, we didn't look at this, but this heartbreaking lamentation over the death of all these baby boys quotes the prophet Jeremiah, in which he imagines Rachel, the ancestress of the Israelite people, mourning their having been destroyed by the Babylonians and taken away into exile. And then we get the return from exile to Nazareth. And at each point, right, Matthew quotes prophecy to show Jesus in his own infancy, recapitulating the whole history of his people. Right? Again, a very powerful rhetorical angle here that Matthew gets to help his people see, right? Jesus was not some fluke, some outcast, some loser who went wrong. Look, he's the Messiah. In his own history, he relives the entire history of our people, all of it signposted by the prophets. So this is a very sophisticated and, on its own terms, very powerful piece of theology. Questions? Get a mic and ask away.
Do any
Yeah.
Do any of you experts find any Homeric parallels, that is, especially in the model of the exile and return and the intervention of cosmic sources in the fortunes of, such as they are, of Jesus?
Yes.
The entire narrative.
Yeah. I mean, there's
You always have, in the Odyssey, you always have Athena turning up and turning her into something and influencing the action.
Right, there's been a good deal of very fruitful investigation as to how the gospel writers, all of whom learned Homer, because that's how you learn Greek in the ancient world, right? How those stories have found their way into some of the plot lines of the Gospels. I mean, in the ancient world, you didn't have like C-spot run kind of readers for elementary Greek, right? You went straight from the alphabet to Homer. That's how you learned it. So it was like teaching Shakespeare to first graders, right? to learn English. Yeah, here, that's how they should do it. Yeah, right, okay. So anyone who could write Greek would know those stories inside out and backwards. Yeah. And Matthew writes in Greek. He is certainly bilingual. We know he can read Hebrew because he does some very clever puns that work only in the Hebrew language. And because when this is getting into the weeds here, but you have the Hebrew scriptures on the one hand, and there's the Greek translations of them, which came into existence about 200 years before Jesus for Jews that couldn't read Hebrew. And in very many places, the translations are, shall we say, creative, right? And occasionally, Matthew will select a Greek translated verse, and sometimes a verse that he translates from Hebrew, because the differences favor his interpretation. So he's a very careful shopper, right? He knows how to pick what he needs from the available merchandise. Yeah, Jim.
I guess one assumption that we often make is that we have access to all of the sources and that Matthew is drawing on. And I'm wondering if you think it's possible that there are sources that he had access to that are lost. We can't assume that all of the ancient manuscripts and so on have been preserved. So I'm wondering if it's possible that there are sources that are lost to us that were known to him.
When you ask a historian, is it possible? The answer is always yes.
Right.
I mean, it's possible that John F. Kennedy, was not killed, but is living someplace in the South Pacific, wasn't actually assassinated. That's possible, right? It's possible men did not walk on the moon. It's possible. The problem is, what's the evidence for it, right? And so we don't have any evidence for any text that we know of that Matthew could have been using to help him make the story. Maybe he did, but we can't find it. And we can't find you can sometimes tell in writing if something is based upon a source that you don't have, because it differs a bit from the style of the writer when he's composing on his own. But we don't have that with these first two chapters. So it's possible, but I'm not sure what difference it makes, because whether he had a source or not, he's incorporated it into his larger story of Jesus, and done so very expertly. So it seems as if there was a pre-existing story, he has adapted it with sufficient skill to serve his own purposes for the larger designs he has for his big sprawling gospel. If this were a college classroom, I'd know what was going on. You want to get out of here and get to lunch, right? Because blah blah blah. You've heard the professor, and he just will not shut up. We still have 5 minutes. I know you're more patient than 19-year-olds are. So
I'm curious about what happened with the gifts from the Magi. I mean, you've described the family as living in poverty or close to poverty, and here they have gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Does this help the family? Do you know?
okay, for one thing, we don't know about their economic condition. We have no idea whether they were poor or what, right? I mean, we know from later in the story, at least from Mark, right, that Jesus was a carpenter or a stonemason. The word goes either way. He was someone who worked with his hands, so he was not wealthy. If you learn that from his father, which he probably did, so this would have been a peasant family. But there's no such thing. I mean, we can't really tell at this point in the story. Nor do we know what those gifts, where they went. For Matthew, it's just enough that they give them. Now, what you want to know is that later as Christians heard these stories, they asked these kinds of questions. What did they do with the gifts? What did Joseph and Mary talk about? And these all get filled out in great detail later on in the Christian tradition, as we have more and more stories about to fill in all the gaps, right? What was Jesus doing between the time he was 12 and the time he's 30? Well, what do you know, right? He goes to Ireland, he goes to Afghanistan, goes to Egypt. All this stuff begins to crop up because curious minds want to know, right? And so we have this wonderful proliferation of these utterly fictitious stories, which are nonetheless responding to this very human desire to know the whole story, right?
I'm curious, is there evidence for, I guess they call it the slaughter of the innocents when all the kids, the male children were killed, other than in gospel sources?
No, there isn't. And that's curious because we do have the historian Josephus who notes quite carefully all the atrocities of Herod and never records this one. So its absence from that makes us doubt this could have happened. But then again, if you think about, a slaughter happening in a relatively small place, affecting probably just a village, it might not have been on the same scale to get remembered a century later. So it's really hard to know. It is absolutely what we call true fiction, right? This is the kind of thing that Herod would do. He would stoop to this level without even wondering about it. So it was believable in that way. But obviously Matthew wants to draw the parallel between Pharaoh slaughtering the boys in Egypt and Herod. And that's his purpose for the story. I think one last question.
Anybody else? Because I asked a few. But I just was thinking about the flight into Egypt. At that point, there was a flourishing Jewish community in Egypt.
Yeah.
So it made a lot of sense to go there.
Yeah.
Although that connection isn't really made in the gospel narrative.
Yeah. And I mean, if you want to know what was happening in Egypt for those times they were there, what do you know? There's a fanciful gospel which tells you. And it's all in this wonderful book that I wrote that you should buy because our winter home in Barbados will not build itself, so please. Well, thank you. I hope at some future time to have a chance to do this again. And if anybody wants to continue the conversation at lunch, I'm going to be up there, so